Hey friends, this is Joseph Maynor. So what I want to do in this video is I want to state a few things that I know about Zen. Just because Zen has had a very powerful influence on me. I visited China and I visited Taiwan. And for many years after I graduated from UCLA in 2005 with a degree in philosophy, I've studied world philosophy, Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and then later on Japanese philosophy. And it's important to understand how the philosophy forged Zen to ultimately become what it is. And I think rather than reading all these books on Zen, right, it almost becomes a parody of itself. And there's a reason why I'm calling it Zen instead of Zen Buddhism. And I want to defend this picture of Zen because I think Zen is actually very simple. That's the point of it. Is that for many, many years now, most likely, you have been on this kind of treadmill with your human philosophies and your divine spiritualities. And the thoughts racing through your mind and, crazy feelings, crazy good, crazy bad, everything in between occurring as well. Your life seems to be like a painful when it's going well and also painful when it's not going well, right? Because when it's going well, you're bored. You feel like, yeah, I got a lot of money, I got a lot of security, but I'm not happy. When you're broke, you're unhappy. Or when you're poor in relationship, you're unhappy. So it seems like, no matter what you do, there's just a certain level of suffering, right? This is where the Buddhism part comes in. Because the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is that suffering exists. The second noble truth is suffering is caused by attachment. The third noble truth is that this suffering can ultimately be fixed or remedied. And the fourth noble truth is that there's a pathway to be able to remedy this kind of suffering. So in this sense, Zen has an ancestor in Buddhism. I don't know why I'm tearing up, why my eyes are tearing up. It's kind of embarrassing. I don't think I'm that emotional as to what I'm talking about right now. It's not being caused that way. So Zen does have an ancestor in Buddhism. And I want to explain that. But then I also want to explain why I call it Zen instead of Zen Buddhism too. Like I want to cut off the Buddhism part. Because I think that in and of itself is a kind of pointer. So without further ado, I want to argue that Zen provides a different account of nothingness or emptiness than what we see in Mahayana Buddhism. Like if you've ever read Nagarjuna, which I have. I took a class in Buddhism at UCLA and I've read a lot of this crap, over the years. And those of you who are Buddhists, pardon me for calling it crap. But, part of reaching Zen is you're going to see all thought stories as crap. That's exactly what this stage of the path is. It's emptying your cup. But the concept of emptiness is not a philosophical concept. That doesn't mean that we throw philosophy away. It just means that there's a spiritual perspective that you can attain which is a higher level spiritual perspective than somebody who's, for example, focused heavily on integration and has no concept of this, no concept of this kind of peace that is not even spiritual peace. Because spiritual peace would be something like Advaita Vedanta, right? Turiya. Or the peace that you get from whatever spirituality you have, whether it's some kind of solipsism or religion or whatever it is, right? You have some kind of thought story that you rely on to buttress your peace. Zen doesn't need that to have peace. The whole point of Zen is to realize that that kind of attachment to integration is causing your suffering. It's a craving. See? Suffering exists, the first noble truth. The second noble truth, suffering is caused by craving. The third noble truth, there's a way to solve this problem. And the fourth noble truth is that there's a path to solving the problem. Well, I think Zen at least wants to address the third one, right? The fourth one is a little iffy, a little dodgy, right? Because Zen is tricky because you don't want people to become ideological Zen people, right? Turning Zen into an ideology, right? Now you got somebody who's creating all these books about Zen. Zen is so simple. It's like nobody could ever become rich truly being a Zen master. Like, because Zen is ultimately about realizing emptiness and embodying that space. And loosening up the attachment to the spirituality, to the philosophy stuff. And you can actually see why this happened if you look at the history of philosophy. So the way that Buddhism started is it started in India. And Indian philosophy is very philosophical. Indian spirituality is very philosophical. The Indians are, just like the Western philosophers, very focused on, stating a one right answer about the nature of reality or the nature of truth, and then kind of worshiping that or believing in that as a kind of philosophy that you live by. Well, Chinese philosophy, it's similar to that. I mean, the Chinese, they have ethical systems. They've had grand metaphysical systems like Neo-Confucianism. But the Chinese are definitely not as interested in metaphysics as the Indian philosophers and the Western philosophers are. I mean, you can look at systems like Taoism that emerged in China. The Tao Te Ching, if you've never read the Tao Te Ching, right? You want an introduction to Chinese philosophy. That's like reading Plato's Republic if you want an introduction to Western philosophy. And Taoism and Confucianism were kind of the liberals and the conservatives, respectively. The Taoists were the liberals. Everything is relative. Everything is yin and yang, kind of. But then there are some, if you look at the Tao Te Ching, like there's some teachings in there too, kind of like peppered in there. So it's not entirely relative. Confucianism is very strict, though. It reminds me of like Islam, but without the metaphysical concerns. It's purely ethical. It's how we relate as persons. When I went to China and I went to Taiwan, Confucianism is just in the air that these people that live in these countries breathe. It's the rules of social engagement. Like the Chinese are like actually very metaphysically tolerant, but ethically very strict. Whereas the Indians are almost the reverse. Like they're very ethically tolerant. Like if you go to India, I've been to India, you'll see every kind of person in India, every kind of religion, every kind of spirituality. You see exact opposite when you go to China. You see one kind of person, right? Taiwan's a lot more liberal that way. Taiwan has more diversity. I recommend that all of you go to Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan, going to Taipei for 2 weeks. I went to Beijing for 2 weeks, and I went to New Delhi for Delhi for 2 weeks. Boy, those three places. I went to Istanbul also for 2 weeks. I've been to a lot of places around the world too, but those four, you can see how like when I went to Istanbul, the Muslims, like they combine the morality of the Chinese with the spirituality of the Indians, or the philosophy of the Indians. So in other words, like in Istanbul, it was like, we are highly moral and highly spiritual. In India, it's like we're highly spiritual. The morality is kind of like live and let live. Like very much so. In China, it's the other way around. Like the morality is very strict, but you can do whatever you want to do spiritually as long as you keep it to yourself, right? God forbid you tell somebody that you have some kind of deviation from, especially in China, not so much in Taiwan. I mean, when I was in Taiwan, I mean, they had like a gay pride parade, It was like Taiwan is actually like way more like liberal than China. But when I went to Beijing, the Chinese are very uniform because they have this like social code that governs like how you have to act. But from a spirituality perspective, I mean, you have Buddhists, you have Taoists, you have, you can actually Mao wiped out spirituality in China, right? So from a spiritual perspective, it's open, right? But you just better not, sort of annoy other people with it, right? Now, what happened is that around 200 BC, apparently, I actually did a small amount of research before I made this video, during the Han Dynasty, because of the trade routes that were happening in East Asia, from East Asia all the way over to like Venice, there was called the Silk Road, where there was that was like a trade highway, ancient trade highway. And so Buddhism actually entered from India into China around 200 BC during the Han Dynasty. And if you've ever read Nagarjuna, and if you've ever studied Mahayana Buddhism, because there's basically two flavors of Buddhism, because you think of Buddhism as a liberal reaction in a way to Hinduism. So in Indian philosophy, you have what are called the orthodox schools and the non-orthodox schools. So Hinduism was considered the orthodox school. So Hinduism in India would be like Confucianism in China, the conservatives, right? The Buddhists in India would be like the Taoists in China, the liberals. So, but in India, there were basically two flavors. Actually, there was a lot more, but it ultimately there became to be like two major flavors of Buddhism: the Theravada and the Mahayana. Theravadins were, I guess, much more, and I'm saying I guess because, we're making generalities here. I mean, there was lots of schools. This would be like somebody like making a distinction between like empiricists and rationalists in Western philosophy and assuming that that's like super clear. But ultimately, I think the Theravadins were focused on individual enlightenment, and the Mahayanas were focused on the Great Basket or the Bodhisattva, or bringing a group of people to enlightenment. So it's like you got the node and the link. So Mahayana is a much more feminine version of Buddhism in the sense that it's focused on the tribe, the community, the link. So that's what entered China around 200 BC during the Han Dynasty, is Mahayana Buddhism. And the first thing that happened is that the Chinese dropped all of the Indian metaphysics, all of the abstractions. Like, if you've ever read Nagarjuna, he has this whole philosophical treatise on emptiness. He talks about emptiness in the way that you can see, like, maybe somebody like, if you've ever read like Sextus Empiricus, Outlines of Skepticism, or whatever it is, Outlines of Pyrrhonism. It's very similar to that. It's like he's building this like massive intellectual argument that says like what emptiness is not, right? Like, it's through the mind, through reason, that we get truth. And one of the first things that the Chinese did, the Chinese hate that, right? Unless it's part of their philosophy. So, for example, Neo-Confucianism, or if it's involving some kind of ethics, But what the Chinese don't typically do is this kind of mental masturbation about thinking that somehow philosophy, this like abstract philosophy, is going to give us the one right answer about reality. This is something that the Western philosophers and Indian philosophers do much more. I call it metaphysics. The Chinese are interested in metaphysics, but they're also kind of like Kant. Like, Kant is very, like, they called Kant the Chinaman of Königsberg, right? Because he wanted to put limits on metaphysics and the emphasis on morality, on this kind of Christian ethic. And that's not a nice term, by the way. Like, that's but that's what they called him, but yeah, it's this idea that, like, metaphysics is some kind of a mental masturbation. So one of the first things that happened to Buddhism as it became Chan Buddhism, Buddhism from India, the Mahayana Buddhism that came into India and then ultimately became Chan Buddhism, and recognized that in China, this was a foreign spirituality / philosophy. Buddhism did not originate in China. It originated in India, and it moved into China. So this is like a foreign system that moved into China that was hugely influential in China. I mean, imagine that happening here, like in the United States. Like, imagine some weird, some foreign spiritual / ethical system just invaded the United States, and like a huge chunk of the population became devotees of it. I don't know, some kind of weird, like, let's just say like new age, like spirituality or something like that hasn't even been developed yet. But we'd have to, as Americans, let's say it came from some foreign country or even some other planet or something like that, right? To just get a little wacky here. We'd still have to we'd have to Americanize it. And so that's exactly what Chan Buddhism was. Chan Buddhism was making the Indian Buddhism Chinese. And the Chinese, the first thing that the Chinese went to war with was this kind of metaphysical mentality, like, believing in some kind of thought story from a metaphysical perspective. The Chinese are very much like this, like, that doesn't do your push-ups for you. Confucius was actually there's a famous quote from Confucius that says, You ask me about God, but we don't even, I'm paraphrasing. You ask me about God, but we don't even understand man. You see? So Buddhism very much became this way to do a kind of therapy around emptying your cup of this kind of metaphysics, of spirituality and philosophy, but still retaining spirituality. Well, that's kind of a paradox. It's called Buddha nature. So how do we like retain a Buddha nature without understanding the nature of reality too? Well, it's because you don't need to understand the nature of reality to have Buddha nature. See, that kind of prerequisite, like you got to know algebra before you can learn trigonometry, right? That doesn't apply in the case of Buddha nature. You don't need to know metaphysics to have Buddha nature. So in part, Zen is about deconstruction or emptying your cup, but it's not a Nagarjuna philosophical account of emptiness. It's not something you're going to go and repeat some kind of mantra or become like an Islamic person. Like when I went to Istanbul, it's like you had all these different people, but when the call to prayer came, everybody stopped what they were doing and went to the nearest mosque, and everybody is one, right? This kind of stage blue utopia. And everybody's similar in the same way. They all have the same ethic and the same spirituality, which is weird, but actually very efficient too. Like when you go to Istanbul, it's one of the greatest like open markets in the world in terms of trading all kinds of things, because everybody knows their place and everybody is the same. And there's really no hierarchy, because in Islam, everybody is actually one with, there's no hierarchy in the relationship between you and God in Islam. In other words, like the relationship that you have with God is not contingent on the Pope, not contingent on the Imam. The Imam is just the person who brings the Muslims together. But the Islam, from like a spiritual standpoint, is not higher than you, because your relationship with God is the only standard. So they have it's a good spirituality for people retaining a kind of human like confidence, but also with the ability to have a spirituality, and everybody is enough of the same that they all kind of take care of each other too. There's this quote like if men knew how to take care of each other, there'd be very little homelessness. There was like no homelessness when I went to Istanbul. There was zero homelessness. So there's pros and cons to everything. But you can see how Zen integrates some Taoist, kind of mentality to tries to retain like a fluidity of mind and openness. Like you pick something up, you put it down, you pick something up, you put it down. So chop wood and carry water, right? You're not going to change anything about what's happened in your life or what's going to happen in your life. All that's going to stay the same. The difference is, though, is you're going to have a Buddha nature, you're going to have a spirituality that's not contingent on some kind of metaphysical premise. In fact, you're gonna realize that over-attachment to spirituality and philosophy causes suffering. That you on that integral hamster wheel, right? The personal development hamster wheel, that causes suffering. And what you'll see, like when you move beyond Zen, is that Zen is a little bit too single-minded in this way. But just like every stage on the path, you've got to dive into this. Every stage is partial. But you really got to feel each stage, just like the divine masculine with Advaita Vedanta. You know, you're going to be the person who's telling everybody that you're consciousness, right? You've got to live it, right? You will live it. And Zen is a wonderful thing because, you know, it follows from the acceptance of teal. Like, you've done a lot of shadow work at this point. So it very much is an acceptance. It's an emptying of your cup. It's not a philosophical emptiness, though. It's like a chop wood and carry water emptiness. It's this, I'm going to give you one pointer. So in Zen, one of the important things is to not stay in the temple too long. The whole point of Zen is that you graduate. So at some point, they kick you out. And you're supposed to go back to your ordinary life. This is not like Indian philosophy where you go and you become some kind of a hermit, right? No, you don't draw those kinds of distinctions. You don't draw those kind of classifications between like the student, the householder, the forest dweller, right? If you look at Indian philosophy, they have these Indians are like the West. They like to categorize and organize things in this kind of way. In Chinese philosophy, the whole point of Zen, it reminds me of the later Wittgenstein. Spirituality as therapy. Just like the later Wittgenstein thought of philosophy as therapy, his version of linguistic philosophy, that if I could only get you to see that all these philosophical distinctions that you're making about language melt away when we look and see how language is actually used. So pragmatism, very much a feature of Chinese philosophy too. And in Zen, how much does your spirituality actually just become a kind of mantra, a kind of distraction, a bypassing? When what you really want to do is you just want to chop wood and carry water. Right? So somehow you've created this faith in metaphysics where it's like you're believing in now you're just believing in some kind of wild story well, we're just imagining everything from some kind of solipsistic perspective. How do we know that other people exist? And look, all this shit is important, right? There's no question about it. You wouldn't be able to become Zen, truly, unless you filled your cup so much you just can't fucking stand it anymore. Right? You become a caricature of yourself. It's like the Judas Priest album Ram It Down. Like Judas Priest became almost like a caricature of themselves on that album, right? Like when you sound like a cover band for your own sound, that's when you know, dude, you probably need some kind of a hard reset. And so that's exactly what Zen is. You know, Zen is about releasing spirituality. This is why spiritual people don't like people that are integrating the divine, right? They don't like Zen. And actually, one of the problems with Zen is if you integrate Zen prematurely, it can actually stop you. It can stunt you from integrating the spirituality and the philosophy that you need to do. You cannot appreciate the empty cup until you have a cup that's so full that it just becomes a heavy weight on you. Then you're ready for Zen. So Zen is a much higher place on the path. It sounds easy and simple, but yeah, because you haven't it's like watching Magnus Carlsen play chess. It looks so easy and so simple. But, Magnus Carlsen put a lot of work into making it look that easy and that simple. I don't know if that's a good example or not. But because when you become Zen, or you integrate the transcendent, you don't throw anything away either. So all that stuff is still here. All that nonsense that you consider about philosophy and spirituality, all that is still here. It's just you have this Buddha nature now that it's just like it's an attainment, it's an enlightenment. And you can call it emptiness, you can call it nothingness, but it's not philosophical. It's not even like, just to say it's embodied is almost too much. Like it's an attainment. It's an awakening. But it's a different awakening than your spiritual or philosophical stuff. It has a different, it solves a different problem. And it's not the final answer either, but it's a place that you might find. And what I'm trying to do is just trying to give a good pointer to that place in a way that invites people to it, but doesn't mislead people about it. Okay, friends, thank you. Hopefully this was a good video. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.